Resuming debate, the honourable member for Surrey North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I will respond to the parliamentary's questions in regards to whether we're for trade or not. He was talking about the NDP and all that. Mr. Speaker, I will be splitting my time, let me get that out of the way, with a member from Beauport-Lemieux. I'll be splitting my time with him, and I'm honoured to speak to Bill C-20, the free trade agreement with Honduras, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, let me just talk about how we got here today. This particular bill has been under time allocation, and those of people that are watching home, the Canadians, time allocation is when this government shuts down a debate. They don't want to debate the bill. They don't want Canadians to find out what it is exactly they're trying to rush through, Mr. Speaker. And we've seen this over and over and over. In fact, they've moved this motion, a time allocation, 53 times in the last this Parliament, Mr. Speaker. And not only that, they put closures on 6 debates. You know, I'm lucky to have the opportunity to speak in this House, but there's many other members that are not going to get the opportunity to speak about this particular bill that's being rushed through this House of Commons, Mr. Speaker. What is the rush? Are they trying to hide something from Canadians? And we've seen the shenanigans this morning in regards to the Unfair Elections Act. We had the Elections Commissioner speaking in the committee there, and we had time allocation movements here. And these are all shenanigans that are being played by this government, and they're trying to hide the real facts, Mr. Speaker, from Canadians. And I'm going to talk about some of those. You know, the parliamentary secretary talked about trade, why we're against trade with Honduras, Mr. Speaker. Well, before I get to that, I want to, you know, what are the principles? What should we be looking at when we're looking into trade agreements with other countries, Mr. Speaker? There are a number of things that I think we need to address to look at which countries we should be getting into partnerships so we do have a trade agreement. Trade is reality. We are a trading nation, and Canadians are very competitive, and we can sell our products to other countries. And I'm very proud that we Canadians have some of the products that other countries want, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there are 3 fundamentally important criteria to assess trade agreements. Let's look at it. Is our partner one who respects democracy, human rights, adequate environment changes, labor standards, and Canadian values, Mr. Speaker? You know, if some of these aren't being met, but is the partner willing to go to meet some of these requirements, Mr. Speaker? So that's one thing. The second thing is the proposed partner's economy of significant and strategic value to Canada? Are the terms of the proposed agreement satisfactory? So let's talk about Honduras, how democratic it is. Let's talk about human rights in Honduras. Mr. Speaker, I can assure you all Canadians have known the history of Honduras. In the last 15, 20 years, I've known the history of Honduras. It's undemocratic, it's corrupt. The last time, in 2009, a democratically elected president was overthrown with a coup. And the condemnation was worldwide. Then there were elections held, and those elections, again, were fraudulent. They were not fair. Guess who condemned those elections, Mr. Speaker? It was the European Union, United States, many countries around the world. And what does Canada do? We want to enter into a trade agreement with a corrupt dictator, a country which is known to be a capital in the Central Americas for drug laundering and all that, Mr. Speaker. That is not the type of country you want to be entering into for free trade agreements. Of course we want to trade. We should be looking at trade agreement with countries that are strategic to Canadian products, where we can increase trade with those countries. Let's take a look at those countries. Let's take a look at Japan. Why don't we have a trade agreement with Japan? We've been negotiating for a number of years. In fact, we started trade agreement negotiations with South Korea. We started negotiating with South Korea before the United States. And guess what? The United States already got a trade agreement with the South Korea. And our farmers, our pig farmers, our beef farmers, are losing billions of dollars every year because this government has not put priority on trade agreements that are going to be beneficial to Canadian producers, Mr. Speaker. We should be negotiating trade agreement with emerging countries. India is one of them. Brazil is another one. South Africa. These countries have populations and they need products that we have here, Mr. Speaker. Yet this government is negotiating a trade agreement with a dictatorship, corrupt government, and the trade we have with that country right now, with Honduras, Mr. Speaker, is $38 million, I think we export. Not very much. What this government wants to do is, we have a trade agreement with 15 countries. Well, Mr. Speaker, if you add up the little countries like Honduras and Liechtenstein, that's not going to add up to even one agreement with one of the emerging countries or with Japan or South Korea. Those are the countries we should be pursuing, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, let's talk about trade, this government's trade record. 8 years ago, when they took over, when they came into government, we had a trade current account surplus of $18 billion. And what is it today, Mr. Speaker, after 8 years? We have a deficit of $62 billion. That's a swing of $80 billion. So rough calculation, about a $10 billion a year. Under this government, we have a trade deficit. And the merchandising deficit. These are the ones, merchandises are value-added goods that we export. Under this government, we've had 23 straight months of merchandising trade deficit, Mr. Speaker. 23 months. And it's growing. It's growing, Mr. Speaker. In order for us to provide good jobs, we need to export goods that we add value, secondary goods. Most of our products that we're exporting out of this country are either not processed at all or barely processed. That's the record that this government has. And how do we improve that, Mr. Speaker? I'll tell you. You improve it by getting our product to our markets. Under this government, we've seen what's happening in the prairies. The wheat is rotting in the fields. Under this government, they've been unable to convince or get the railroad companies to get the product out to the ports. And once it gets to the ports, guess what's happening at the Port of Vancouver, Mr. Speaker? There has been a simmering labor dispute there for the last 4 or 5 years. And this government, I've spoken up in this House to let the government know to address this situation before it gets to a point where we have a shutdown. And guess what, Mr. Speaker? This morning at 12 o'clock Pacific time was the deadline for a strike at a major port of Vancouver. And what has this government's been doing for the last 4 years? Even last 6 months when I've mentioned it in this House, it's been sitting on their hands. They could have appointed a mediator 6 months ago, Mr. Speaker. And when was the mediator appointed? This morning. And the talks are ongoing. Hopefully things will be resolved, Mr. Speaker. But it's under this government that we are at a verge point where our major port could be shut down. So in order for us to support our exporters, we need to build infrastructure. We need to ensure our ports are freely functioning. We need to ensure that our traders are supported. We need to ensure that we have consular services, trade services overseas, that we can identify some of the buyers for our products. Those are the kind of things that this government needs to do, Mr. Speaker. However, Mr. Speaker, I know my time is very limited. I want to say, Mr. Speaker, under this government, they have failed our exporters, Mr. Speaker.
Here, here.